Hi, I'm Thomas Thomas Trebilcock. Let me tell you the story of my life. My story started when I was born on August 28, 1855, in Cornwall. I was baptized on October 28, 1855, in Cornwall. My father John Trebilcock was born in 1825, my mother Nancy May was born in 1822, both in Cornwall. When they married in 1848, my mother was 3 years older than my father. I had 3 brothers and sisters. My sister Matilda was the eldest. Born in 1851. Then came my brother Adolphus in 1853. Both in Cornwall. Last but not least, my youngest brother Alfred was born in 1861 in South Australia. We left for South Australia departing Liverpool on February 19, 1859 on the schooner James Jardine. We left with 352 people on board, but before she reached South Australian waters 5 children had been born and 6 people had died. We arrived at Port Adelaide on June 29, 1859, taking 131 days to complete the trip. In 1871 I purchased part of Section 835 called Hillside, from Nicholas Woolcock. As I was only 16 years old, my father, John Trebilcock, purchased this land in my name. I married Sarah Harriet Possingham on May 10, 1880 at the Wesleyan Church, Houghton, at age 24. She was born in 1862, in Houghton. She was 18 years old when we married, 6 years younger than me. We had 9 children: Irene, John, Thomas, Myrtle, Frank, Lancelot, Cecil, Victor, and Percival. We all lived at Hillside, but around the turn of the century I built a bigger home called Hillview. In 1908 Sarah died and my daughter Myrtle brought up the rest of the family. An article from the Advertiser, January 28, 1910. Montacute, January 25, Mr. T. Trebilcock had his wagonette overturned and the pole broken on Monday. The horses suddenly took fright, and bolted, going over a steep embankment, and running into a fence. Fortunately the vehicle was unoccupied. Mr. Ashley Trebilcock, his son, met with an accident on Monday while driving a horse and cart, accompanied by his 2 brothers to Montacute. The horse shied, throwing out the occupants, who escaped with bruises and a shaking. I started a jam factory at Hillview to use up the surplus fruit. During my life at Montacute, I acquired a considerable amount of land both in 6th Creek and 5th Creek and gave the land, on which St. Paul's Church of England is built. I also donated the land for the Montacute Cemetery. I also owned houses and land in the metropolitan area. In 1923 my son Percival and I moved to 21 3rd Avenue Jocelyn. When I was in my 70s I used to walk from Jocelyn to Montacute on Sunday mornings to visit my son Ashley and family who lived at Hillside. I had a little shed opposite the Montacute Cemetery where I used to stay sometimes overnight when visiting them. When I was 75, I owned a car and one time I was trying to turn the car around and accidentally put it into forward gear instead of reverse and the car took off down over the hill through the cherry orchard. Everyone held their breath until I finally got the car back up the hill onto the track. This was the day after my son Ashley had run his car off the driveway at home with the 4 eldest children in it and rolled the car 6 times down the hill before coming to rest. An article from Toilers of the Hills by E. H. Howlack, 1893. Further on is Mr. T. T. Trebilcock's garden, which is planted on both sides of the road. Its 8 acres are beautifully situated on goodly soil just below St. Paul's Church. Oranges, apples, plums, loquats and apricots are contained in this orchard, and the younger trees in the plantation above the road were looking well, their foliage being especially healthy, in spite of many of their stems having been partially barked by hares. Strawberries planted between them had yielded an excellent crop, and a lucerne plot had done well on this elevated portion of the garden. Of apples, even Pomeroys were seen bearing near the homestead, but it looked as if it were their last effort in the matter of productiveness, as several of the trees were leafless. Plums were bearing well, and loquats were looking ditto, but apricots were so much diseased that several had been cut down last season and grafted with plums, of several varieties. I passed away on May 2, 1943 at St. Anthony's Private Hospital, Joslin, and was buried in the Montacute Cemetery. I'm so glad I got to share my story with you. I hope you enjoyed watching.
Hello, I'm David Trebilcock and these are my memories of my grandfather. As the fifth in a family of 6 children, I had little contact with my paternal grandfather. I remember him as a stern, upright man with a long white beard, who spoke little to us smaller members of the family and then with a grave, unsmiling demeanor. I remember being reprimanded by him when I asked to borrow his game of solitaire which he had personally crafted. His reply was, "Not today, it's Sunday." In the small village of Montacute there were 2 churches, St. Paul's Anglican, right at the very top of the hill overseeing both the 6th Creek to the north and the 5th Creek to the south, and by what seemed the smaller, humbler, Methodist chapel in the 5th Creek Valley. My father Thomas Trebilcock was a lay preacher but did very little preaching to my knowledge, and I was well aware of grandfather's strong nonconformist affiliations. I was also very conscious of the fact that most other Trebilcocks were Anglicans. As children it seemed a bit unfair that there were often times when we had to attend Sunday school and church twice over, in the morning at St. Paul's and in the afternoon at the chapel. Did I imagine that we were looked upon by other Trebilcocks with some condescension? Were we the poor Christian relations in the little chapel, while those more favored parishioners who sang lofty hymns of praise nearer to God on the top of the hill? It even had a bell in a bell tower and the parson wore a nightie. I came to a somewhat more rounded view of life in my teenage years, particularly as my mother, whose maiden name was O'Brien, told me of her experience as a child in Kelly Country in Victoria when the prods and mix had slanging matches on the way to and from school. I was further enlightened by her stories of education in a convent school by the request of her parents. It was not until a few years ago that I learnt of the genesis of the family divide from my older brother Jeff, who spent more time with grandfather on his visits to Hillside in Montacute. He told Jeff that he bought the property as a young man in his teens with the help of his father and began to establish it as an orchard. Even at a young age he apparently was of a very serious nature and felt the need for a spiritual life. At that time the only established place of worship was the Methodist chapel, and so that is where he went. He said that this caused a serious and permanent rift with his father, and we gather that this was never really mended. He subsequently married a girl from a neighboring congregation, and the result was a family of 9. It is interesting to note that although there is some evidence of sectarian rivalry in the family myths handed down, there are some signs of practical ecumenism. When St. Paul's was built it was on land donated by Thomas. We look at chapel records and we find Norman Trebilcock, whose family I understood to be staunch Church of England members, listed as a trustee, and although we might have grumbled about being overchurched, in retrospect our experiences in both areas, plus the fact that our maternal grandfather was named O'Brien and our mother well equipped to relate her stories of prods and mix in up-country Victoria, gave us a much broader view of the world and served us well in meeting the challenges of adult life. So what was the real nature of Thomas Trebilcock? There is no doubt that he was a strict parent, a hard worker, a faithful Methodist and a respected member of the community. My mother knew him from a different perspective. His revered wife bore him 9 children and died at the age of 46. She was the disciplinarian who reportedly carried a strap at her waist to maintain the required order. Nobody spoke at the table until father gave permission. The younger children were all in bed when father came in from his toil in the orchard. He was also apparently successful in the business world, owning numerous properties in metropolitan Adelaide on his death in 1943. In all he must have filled a prominent position in the district in the first half of the 20th century.